So, we are here today to meet with Stephen Porder, who is an Amherst alumnus, thus the purple shirt, although he said he didn't even think of that. It's not possible. We're really going to enjoy a conversation between these two notable people about Stephen's book, which is this one, which is on the table over there. That's the subject of the conversation. But let me do the formal introductions here. Stephen is a professor with an exceedingly long title at Brown University. He's the Acacia Professor of Ecology, Evolution, and Organismal Biology, and Environment and Society. Those are two different departments at Brown. And he's also the Associate Provost for Sustainability at Brown University. So he wears many hats and has lots of expertise. His research focuses on an interdisciplinary investigation of terrestrial ecosystems that combine all of our favorite topics, ecology, biogeochemistry, and geology all together. And as in his sustainability position, he's leading the charge to eliminate fossil fuel combustion and to make from campus and to make Brown a zero carbon institution by
2040, but 75% reduction by 2025.
Which is 2 years.
Hurry up.
Yep. And he is now the author of this new book, which discusses just what we were just talking about, the habitability of the planet and what it depends on. And the conversation will be between Stephen and our guest Nancy Pick, who is also an Amherst alum. Some of you might be familiar with her. She's widely published, but closer to home, she's the author of Curious Footprints, about the Hitchcock collection of dinosaur footprints, and the author of I, Mind, Heart, which is the Amherst College Centennial History volume. In this conversation, you should know that the two of these people, Nancy and Stephen, are not strangers to each other. So Stephen's known the Pick and Douglas families since he was a student here. And Nancy and Stephen are co-founders of a podcast on public radio in Rhode Island called Possibly. It's driven by student reporters who dive deep into sustainability science, reporting what is known and what we don't know, and about how the environment is changing and what we can do about it. They focus on small things, like the most efficient way to boil a cup of water. Oh my God, do I need to know that? Boiling about 4 or 5 cups a day. So, so he's got a lot of expertise and he's working on a lot of fronts, but today we're going to hear about this front, about this new book. They're going to be in conversation for a little while, and then we're going to throw it open to questions from everybody, and then there are books for sale that he can sign for you while he's here if you want to do that. $25 cash and carry. It's all yours.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tekla. So, as Tekla mentioned, I've known Stephen since he was a sophomore here, and I think that qualifies as geologic time. It's not often that you can say that a friend changed your life, but we'll get to that a little later. This is a big picture book, the kind that honestly makes me proud to have gone to this college, because scientists are so often lost in the weeds, and they often struggle to communicate important ideas to the general public. But this book offers brilliant clarity. Reading Elemental, I felt like I was looking at Earth from Mars. And not only that, but I was seeing the Earth with a kind of time-lapse photography in billions of years, which ended up condensed into 200 very readable pages. You made me see the climate history of our planet in an entirely new way. So let's start by introducing the basic concepts of the book. How would you describe it in a nutshell, an elevator?
So first of all, thank you, Tekla, and thank you all for coming. And thank you. I would just say that before I even describe the book, that I'm so grateful to Nancy for teaching me how to write at all for a general audience, to Lawrence for teaching me how to write at all in a scholarly way, and for Tekla and the rest of the geology department for helping me see the world in a completely novel way. And I talk about that a bit in the book, and maybe we'll come to that later. But I just want to express my gratitude to some of the people in the room because they've all been very, very foundational to who I am today. So we'll start with that. Okay, so what's the book about? My elevator pitch. The book is about three things. It's about the rare times in the 4 billion year history of life on Earth where organisms have really profoundly changed the world, like in a big way. That's thing number one. Thing number two is that there is a common thread in the way that organisms change the world. It's actually based in these 5 elements that make up over 99% of the atoms in our body. And so the third part of the book is about how understanding that elemental thread, the thing that connects all world-changing organisms, will help us build a more sustainable future. And the reason for that is that it's probably not a spoiler alert that humans are the third world-changing organism. And so by understanding our connection to our world-changing predecessors, we can learn how to build a more sustainable future. So there's my nutshell.
So Elemental is organized into 3 parts: past, present, and future. And we human beings tend to think that we're unique, but it turns out that we have a lot in common with cyanobacteria and plants. So what can the geologic past tell us about our modern environmental problems and how we all fit?
So one of the great things about my experience at Amherst was that it taught me a new way to see the world. Like, I didn't know before I took geology that there was a reason why the Earth kind of looked the way it did. And that was revolutionary to me. Biogeochemistry, which is the field that I'm in now, is similarly revolutionary and was revolutionary for me, and it underpins thinking in this book. And imagine, like, we are very different from bacteria and plants in a lot of ways.
Talk to me for yourself.
Fair enough. But all organisms on this planet have to solve the same problem, which is they have to gather the elements that make up all the molecules in their body from an environment of a very different composition. So,
and then there was light.
Sustainability, gotta save electricity.
The museum is officially closed.
Okay, we're done. Thanks for coming. So we have to gather these elements from our environment, and to do that we need energy. And so the cyanobacteria, who were the first world changers, they solved a problem of getting energy in a new and very efficient way and getting food in a new and efficient way. And that together allowed them to wildly proliferate, but accidentally change the world. Land plants did the same thing. They moved photosynthesis onto a surface that wasn't being used, basically onto land. They captured this new source of energy, and their side effects also changed the world. And then humans, well, what did we do? We found a new source of energy, a new way to feed ourselves, and now we're changing the world. So our link is elemental. It is through these 5 elements that make up our bodies, and in our innovation in gathering them from our surroundings.
5 elements? Who knows which ones they are? Very clever. We fought hard, actually, to get these labeled this way on the cover of the book, which I personally think is very cool and quite clever.
And I fought hard against this cover entirely because I was sure my idea was better, but it turned out that theirs was better. So no one to give up is a good lesson.
HOCNP, I think you struggled for a long time to see if there could be some sort of acronym or catchy kind of way to refer to those 5 elements, but there just isn't. But nonetheless, you picked these 5 and why?
So they are the 5 most abundant elements in our body in order. Hydrogen and oxygen are the first 2, and that's mostly water, and then carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. And so they're the most abundant, but they also are linked to the gases that control our climate. So C and O are together in carbon dioxide, C and H are together in methane, N and O are together in nitrous oxide. And so these are the greenhouse gases that regulate our climate. And so when you have an innovation in the use of these elements that changes where they are in the earth, whether they're in the air, the ocean, or the land, and how much, then you actually have this potential to feed back and change the world in a profound way. Also, because it's a struggle to get these elements from the environment, if the amount of them changes, you change the amount of life on Earth. So for example, when modern photosynthesis evolved, probably 3.5 billion years ago, you probably increased the amount of living cells on the planet by a factor of at least 10, because there was a new way of using sunlight to gather all these new elements. So they're profoundly limiting to the numbers of us that can be here, and they also have an effect on the environment we live in. So one of the really, am I going to do on cut me off? It's okay. Can I say one more thing?
Yeah, one more
One of the really interesting things that emerged for me from learning this field and thinking about this book is I'd always conceptualized, when people say Earth is a living planet, that always meant to me that there was life on Earth. Like, it's a planet that hosts life. But I never really thought of it as a planet that was completely shaped by life, as opposed to just hosting it, until I began to think about the interplay between the elements that are in our bodies and the elements that control the climate. And so that two-way street of the living planet sort of changed the way I think about things.
So, good basic groundwork here.
Okay.
Right? Basic sense of the book now established. I wanted to step back for a moment and say that your unusual academic background makes me actually feel good about liberal arts. And the liberal arts potential for creating unpredictable and dynamic pathways in life. You were a history major at Amherst, and then somehow, I think mainly because you love to ski out west, that led to a master's in geology and then a PhD in biology or biogeochemistry. And yet, you didn't even major in science at Amherst. You did still take courses here, though, that began to shape your understanding of climate and the big picture. And can you talk about the role that Amherst played in your...
Sure. So, well, I wasn't kidding that Lawrence Douglas taught me to write. I had him for intro poli-sci, the first, I think your first semester here, is that possible?
That's before LGST existed.
Yeah. And I got a B-.
Don't remember that.
I don't remember exactly. No, but I had so many profound learning experiences from the expertise that is here, and it really was across the campus. So I was just telling, I guess, Victor this story about, I turned in the first chapter of my history thesis to a professor named Kevin Sweeney, who isn't here anymore, I don't think. Just retired. And it was like 25 pages, because history people read a lot, it's like what you're supposed to do. And I was sure I was a good writer, I was a senior, and I got 5 pages of tight notes back, stapled to the back of my chapter, and 3 different colors of ink, each one indicating a different kind of comment on the thesis. And I was mortified and convinced that I was obviously a complete moron, because who would, but of all the things I wish I had saved from when I was here, I wish I had saved that, because that lesson about how your writing can be better, and how criticism it's not criticism, it's suggestions to make you better. That was a really profound lesson for me, and I got a lot of those here. I noticed, Nick, you have the Josh Schimmel book. There's a book on writing that a scientist colleague of mine wrote. It was on Nick's desk, and in it says, if you're a scientist, you're a professional writer. And I think that we underestimate how important communication is when you're in the weeds of the science and you're looking at garnets in a rock, or folds and thrusts and horsts and grobens. You miss that most people don't care about that. They want to learn about stories, and they want to learn about the intellectual thread that connects things, and they want to learn about connections. And so the opportunity to jump around between the history of Vermont when it was an independent republic, which is what my thesis was about, and metamorphism of the Athens Dome, which is what my wife's thesis was about. That's right, we found it in that room. That was really exciting and fun. I came to Amherst because there were no distribution requirements, mostly because I didn't want to take a language, which I'm regretting now because I'm really interested in France. But anyway, it was a place to play across all boundaries. And I was just having this conversation with a colleague the other day. I could have been a professor of anything. I really like to think, and I like to think about puzzles. And there really isn't any difference between history and geology and biogeochemistry. You have something, you're trying to figure out how it got that way and what that means. And yeah, we had different tools like mass spectrometers versus sitting in the basement reading microfiche. And outdoor rock hammer.
Think about that.
Yeah, well, believe me, like when I learned you could go outside and do this stuff, I was like, okay, I'm a geologist. But it's all kind of the same, right? You're like a detective, and you're trying to figure out how the world got to be the way it is. And then one of the things that's really changed about my own academic trajectory is that I've really decided that for the last bit of my career.
Don't interview yourself completely.
Darn it! Sorry.
Sorry, I'm going to cut you off.
Right. I didn't decide anything. I didn't decide. I have no idea.
First, we're going to have you read a little bit from the book, actually, because since Amherst does play a role in the book, it seems like everybody would want to hear. Page 15.
Okay, I'm glad you told me what page it was, because I had no idea. Okay, so this is from the first chapter after the introduction. It's called The Biggest Environmental Change of All. Do you have how long you want me to read, or I'll just read it a page or two?
Yeah, read a page.
The history of Earth is one of environmental change. Dinosaurs have come and gone, so have saber-toothed tigers, mastodons, and myriad other creatures we know only from fossils. The biggest change, however, is not recorded in the remains of animals, but in the rocks that house no fossils at all. It is a change recorded by the color red. Perhaps you've seen red rocks in the spectacular cliffs of the Grand Canyon, the towers of Monument Valley, or, as I first did, in the Pioneer Valley of western Massachusetts. If you're like me, you paid them little heed. It wasn't until I took a geology class in college that I even noticed that rocks had colors, and that most of the rocks around Amherst, Massachusetts, where I was in school, were red. One of my first geology professors, with the very geologic-sounding name Professor Belt, seemed obsessed with red rocks. He pressed us to think hard about why some were red and others were not. At the time, their redness seemed a quirky, unimportant question, and I didn't give it much thought. When we put "Whence the Red Beds" on a class t-shirt, it was more a sophomoric jab at Professor Belt's seemingly unwarranted enthusiasm than an attempt to embrace his question. I recall this with regret. I've since come to understand that the red rocks are evidence of the biggest environmental change in the history of Earth, and certainly the biggest initiated by its inhabitants. Not surprisingly, Professor Belt knew much more than we did about what was important in the history of our planet.
Good storytelling, as you can hear. There are some great characters in the book, especially the guy who ran the lumber grader in Vermont, who always asked you tough questions that you couldn't answer. There are many places where you figured out ways to get concept across in simple and memorable ways. And you talked about carbon in terms of a bank account. I suspect that this approach looks easy now. In retrospect, it looks easy as you're reading the book, but it's probably not so easy to figure this out. And what did that look like?
Well, it looked like sending you a lot of drafts and you telling me that they stunk. So, yeah, it's a real challenge to write even quasi-articulately. And I think that I definitely, well, I know that I've not mastered it. My mom loved to read science for the lay public. She really, really loved Stephen Jay Gould, who used to write these essays in Natural History magazine about evolution and the fossil record. And he did it with this sort of charm and easy style that I would be so thrilled to even, come close to. And I always try to think of that. There aren't any other scientists in my family, but they're all very smart people. And so I often try to think about them as my audience. Interested and interesting people who have no special knowledge. And when I write, I do my best to eliminate jargon. It's trite to say that Einstein has this quote that if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. And I figure if that's true for Einstein, which is thinking about much more complicated things than I am, I should aim for that. And the other thing, I guess, is to be relentlessly, I try to be much more Hemingway than Proust, I guess I would say. Like, shorten your sentences, keep things clear, don't hide behind language that is opaque and obscure when you don't when you don't need to. And I don't know, I'm not sure I succeed, but I try to write as much as possible as I talk, as opposed to a separate way of writing, which is less beautiful, but perhaps more effective at communicating things that are complicated enough by themselves without needing the extra complication of language.
So, having talked a little bit about the writing, maybe we can go into the weeds a little bit more now.
I love weeds.
I know you do. I have the weed whacker just in case things do get too nerdy here. But so I basically came into reading this book knowing something about the cyanobacteria and how they oxygenated the earth. But what really blew my mind was your description of how plants came out of the ocean and figured out how to live so much bigger and better. In fact, they were so successful that they did the opposite of what we're doing now. They sucked so much carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere that they triggered ice ages that was in fact fantastically destructive for their own life form. And I thought, oh my God, this is really fascinating, right? They're like the mirror image of human beings, and that really opened my eyes, and I just wanted you to talk a little bit about that in more detail.
Sure, so the first part of the book is about our world-changing predecessors, and Nancy mentioned the cyanobacteria, and the cyanobacteria are really a story of carbon and nitrogen, mostly, so I'll leave that aside for now and talk about the plants. So imagine that so plants in their photosynthetic machinery, they actually inherited that evolutionarily from cyanobacteria and other photosynthetic organisms in the ocean. And if you're living in the ocean, water is abundant. You don't have to worry about the first two elements, H and O, right? And cyanobacteria had evolved ways of getting carbon and nitrogen, and they were really profoundly limited by those elements that are derived from rock, like phosphorus. If you're floating in the ocean, a sunlit ocean in the middle of the Pacific, and there's carbon dioxide dissolved in the water, and you can get that, and there's sunlight, and you can certainly get water, and you can fix nitrogen, which pull it out of the atmosphere, which cyanobacteria can do. What are you stuck? Why aren't you infinitely abundant? You're not infinitely abundant because there's other elements that you can't get, like phosphorus. So plants move onto land, and it takes them evolutionarily a very long time to figure out how to stay hydrated, because they're no longer living in the ocean. They need hydrogen and oxygen, but they're not floating in water anymore. As they proliferate across the land, though, they get access to a new energy source, because all that sunlight that was falling on the land and not being trapped by life, or at least probably by fungal crop, like little crusts of things, but not a lot of life, they have this abundant new energy. And what do they do with that energy is they engineer ways to keep water. So they build roots and they build associations with fungi that allow them to suck water out of the soil that they're making. But they also acidify and increase the weathering rate of the rocks beneath their roots, and thereby allow themselves access to those elements that were limiting to their ocean predecessors. Why does that then cause an ice age eventually? There's a long story, and I apologize to people who really study this, because when you write a 200-page book about all of life history, you omit a lot. But there's a couple of reasons. The first one is obvious. If you have a whole bunch of carbon stuck in wood, right, that's carbon that's no longer in the atmosphere, so that's going to cool the planet by removing CO2 from the air. And if that carbon happens to get buried sort of by geologic happenstance in swampy areas and not decompose, that carbon is stored. But they also increase the rate at which rocks weather by acidifying and increasing and breaking rock apart physically. And that reaction itself consumes CO2. It's the long-term regulator of CO2 in the atmosphere, is the weathering of silicate rocks and the transfer of carbon from the atmosphere to the ocean floor where it's deposited as limestone. That's the long-term regulator on climate at million-year timescales. So plants pull a whole bunch of carbon from the air, they increase the weathering rate, and both of those suck enough carbon out of the atmosphere that you profoundly change the climate. Can I say what comes next? Or? No. Okay. I knew she was going to say that.
I'm here for a reason, you know. Yeah. All right, a little bit of a philosophical question.
Sure.
So I think some of the comfort that I found in reading this book is that it made me realize on some level that humanity isn't evil. I mean, it's easy to think that we've used our big human brains in some very destructive ways and that we're destroying the planet. But here's the thing that I learned from you. Plants did the same thing. They used the planet's elements to their best advantage to grow as much as possible, and then they ruined things for themselves. So perhaps it's not so much that humans are evil. I mean, stepping back and taking the very long geologic view, how do you think about humanity and our role on the planet?
Yeah, so I think I'm not really worried about the planet. So like the planet's going to be here a long time, and it's fine, and it's been through a lot. I think it's more about us, right? But I think we are unique in the rate at which we're changing things. We are not unique in the fact that we are changing things, but we are still rare even in that. I think though that our critical I think that our critical difference is that we can see what's coming, and actually we have an out, right? And we have an out that the cyanobacteria and the plants didn't have, and that's that we can wisely manage the flow of these elements as opposed to accidentally manage. And I don't know if you want to talk about that later.
No, this is the time now.
Okay. I just want to know what the rules are. Yeah. So if a cyanobacterium replicates and then there are 2 cyanobacteria, they put out twice as much oxygen as they did when there was just one of them. You can't have population growth of cyanobacteria without increasing the amount of oxygen. And it's the oxygenation of the planet was the first big change. If you have plants photosynthesizing and sucking up carbon and weathering rocks, the more plants you have, the more that will happen in general. Almost all human energy use is not for our bodies. It's for all the other stuff. It's for the lights, it's for our cars, it's for our airplanes. And all of that stuff is gettable without affecting the carbon cycle, because we don't need carbon-based energy to provide those things. One of the reasons that I'm much more optimistic than I was a decade ago about the future of our century is that I can see a path now, at least 75% of a path, towards a time when we're not relying on carbon-based energy and we're not changing the carbon cycle. Right? And that path was much more opaque 10 years ago. Likewise, we are going to continue to impact the flow of water and nitrogen and phosphorus around the planet as we feed ourselves, but we can understand how to mitigate those consequences. Not 100%, we're not there, but there are a lot of examples in the book and a lot of examples that aren't in the book about massive improvements to the way that we manage those other critical elements. So we are world changers, we are doing it really fast. We really need urgency in being more mindful of the way that we change the flows of these elements, but we can see the way forward. And unlike our world-changing predecessors, it's really doable for us. We can build a sustainable society, and I think that we're much further towards it than we think, and that at its heart, it has to revolve around these elements because they are the critical constituents of all life on Earth. So that's sort of what the last part of the book is about.
So I told you at the beginning that I would talk about how you changed my life, or our lives. For years now, Stephen has been promoting the electrify everything philosophy. So, we now have 2 solar panels at home. We have not 1, but 2 electric cars. We have mini splits, heat pumps in every room of the house, and I just got an induction plate. So I feel like I try to be 2 years behind Stephen. But I hear so many friends, who have some disposable income. So I'm like, I'm waiting to get an electric car, until the new models come out, blah, 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 right? Like, Stephen just got us to stop making excuses to actually change our lives. And I think you should all call your parents and tell them, okay, the time is now. We need to start making these changes. And I don't know if you think of yourself as sort of a climate activist, as sort of, my sense was you were a mild-mannered professor, and now you're something different. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. I think my wife would disagree with the mild-mannered part, but I take your point. So I guess I started my Ph.D. in 2000. And for the first 15 to 16 years of my career, I studied what I would call basic science, like biogeochemistry of tropical forests and maybe a little bit about agriculture. And every year I felt a little bit more like I was rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. I said this at lunch today, and like the world was on fire and I wasn't doing anything about it. I'm not a chain myself to the White House fence kind of person.
Or cementing your feet to the...
I'm not going to cement myself to the Mona Lisa, like whatever, or to the US Open stand. But there are many ways of being an effective change agent, and one of the things I decided was that, I have whatever 20 years left of my career, and I want every single day to try and climb that hill, and if I die on that hill, so be it. It's a good hill to die on, is to try and save the world. So I'm not grandiose enough to think that I would save the world by myself, but I do know that we won't save it if we don't all try. And so I switched my teaching around. I don't teach about problems anymore. I teach only about solutions. I switched my research around. I switched my time at Brown around to decarbonization and other sustainability goals focused around these elements. Actually, our sustainability plan is wildly different than any other university sustainability plan because it's focused on these elements and their management mostly. And so I have become a sort of proselytizing pain in the butt activist. But at the same time, what are we gonna, we have to fix this problem. And we can fix this problem. That's what's so encouraging, is that we actually can do it. And I didn't think that when I was a PhD student, but I do think it now. And it doesn't mean that the future's gonna be easy. But look, 10 years ago, if you had asked me how much warmer it was going to be at the end of the century, I would have said 4.5 degrees Celsius, which is basically an unimaginable world to me. If you ask me now, and we have other climatologists in the room who can argue, but I would say our most likely trajectory is 3 degrees, which is still a really much warmer planet. Yeah, it's not good, right? So that's one way to look at it, is oh no, we still suck, right? But the other way to look at it is, in a decade, we've shaved 1.5 degrees off, right? We've gone from 4.5 to 3. We are often wrong in this field about making predictions. We're wrong about how fast ice sheets are disintegrating, probably, right? But we're also wrong about how fast the cost of solar comes down, how fast batteries improve, how fast we can change the way that we use nitrogen on farms. I have a friend who's radically reshaping Iowa agriculture as we speak to be 95% better in terms of nutrient loss. And farmers are signing up so fast that she doesn't have enough staff to get them out there in the field. Things can change, right? And so we are wrong on the how bad it can get front, but we're also wrong on the how fast we can fix it front. And I've decided that that's where my focus is going to be. And if it ends up being worse than I thought, okay, I didn't, we just have to do your best. But I don't want to retire or die and think that I didn't do my best. And so what's the alternative?
Inspiring. Maybe the last question then is, what's your advice to students here at Amherst? How do you shape a life where you hopefully come out of here learning to think and write and find a fulfilling and compelling way to spend your days?
Yeah, this is why I hope no one asked me to give a graduation speech, because I follow your passion, and always be curious, and blah, blah, blah. But following your passion and always be curious. I would say that I had this really profound experience when I stopped teaching about problems and I started teaching about solutions. I got an entirely different mix of students in the room. And I would just encourage you all to think of yourselves as working to fix things and to wake up every morning and try and make the world a little bit better, rather than focusing on and gathering as many skills as you can to do that in whatever way that means to you. We have lots of problems to work on. Wake up every morning and try and make the world a better place. That's number one. I think number two, and I'll say this in our incredibly politicized and sort of polarized world that we live in, is to approach everybody else with the understanding that they probably also woke up in the morning trying to make the world a better place, however they see that. They did not wake up in the morning to say, you know what I really want to do today is make the world worse. Like nobody wakes up like that. So when you run into someone who doesn't agree with you or who has a different approach to making the world better, try and come at it to find a solution together, as opposed to just thinking they're a bad person who woke up in the morning trying to make the world a worse place, because most likely they didn't do that. And so one of the things that I really, it's very hard, especially around issues of climate and environment for me, because I care so passionately about it, to talk to people who either don't prioritize it or don't believe the science, or because they're in a different identity group or whatever, are not interested in climate. And I make it a point, actually, to spend more time talking with people like that than anybody else, because I feel like that's the conversation I want to have, because I want everybody on board for this solution. That's my approach. It doesn't have to be everybody's approach, but I would approach whatever solution space you're going into with an open heart and a general feeling that people may not agree on what is good or just or equitable, but they're trying to get to that place too from whatever their lens is, and try and find common ground. Then the last thing I'll say, if I may, one of the most profoundly influential things in my own learning, I went to a talk when I was a master's student at Missoula in Montana by E.O. Wilson, who's like one of the most famous conservation biology people in the world. He was an ant specialist at Harvard. He studied ants, but by the time I saw him, he was like advisor to the UN and to presidents all over the world, and he went around being Harvard professor, pontificator. And a student in the crowd asked him, like, how do you get to be E.O. Wilson? Like, you studied ants, and now you have this like incredible voice everybody in the world listens to. And he said, become an expert in something, and then you'll have a seat at the table, and you can talk about the bigger things. And so, in my own experience, I could explain the carbon cycle in layperson's terms to the president of my university, and that's what got us from anemic climate goals to eliminating fossil fuel combustion from the campus, because I could explain to her, and I was enough of an expert. My climate science friends will tell me right away that I'm not a climate scientist. And even my carbon cycle friends will tell me, I don't really know the carbon cycle like they do. But I could explain it well enough, right? And I had a seat at the table because I was an expert in something. So use your expertise well, but don't be constrained by it. That's my advice.
Thank you. I think we should thank both our guests for their time. They are both willing to entertain questions, any kind of questions.
Yeah, please.
Let me get out of the way.
Yeah.
Hello. Thank you very much. My question may be a little bit strange.
Good.
And it is actually about the worldviews you've just talked. I'm a biochemistry major, so I approach things maybe a little bit too much biologically. In previous eons, the cycles of carbon, for example, or phosphorus or other elements were not ideal. And a lot of those elements were buried in the ground, and now the life cannot access it. So, for example, carbon in forms of coal, oil, and gas. Wouldn't you say that it's actually our duty as a civilization that appeared on this planet to dig out all the oil, all the gas, burn it, and return the carbon back into the ecosystem, so more living things can be made out of it?
That's a very interesting question. No. I wouldn't say that. So, let me say this. I don't think there is such a thing as good for the environment or bad for the environment. And if we dug up all the coal and oil and burned it, we could create a pan-tropical world that would be a pan-tropical world, and life would go on, right? The vast majority of life on Earth is microbial, and they'll be fine. Like, they evolve very rapidly, and they can live in all sorts of horrible situations. I'm not worried. Living through the transition between where we are now and that world, if we did that, would be really, really, really hard and bad for people, right? And for a lot of other things too. And also, I don't see that there's a moral, like, it's not immoral for that coal to have been buried. Like, it's just buried sunlight, photosynthetic energy. It's part of, it's like saying it's bad that Pangea broke up. Like, okay, like, put a bit, I just read it's going to come back together. So, okay, and that's, there is no morality there, right? It just is. But we have to make decisions. I think one of the things that I've really come to be, it's different about my environmental philosophy than it used to be. I used to sort of yearn for a time where humans didn't impact the earth and it just did its thing. And for better or worse, we don't have that privilege anymore. We have the option to manage by neglect, which is what we're doing now, and just let the unintended consequences of our actions sort of spill out and whatever happens, happens. Or we can manage wisely, but we don't have the option to not manage at all. I would not be in favor, just on the record, of burning all the oil, coal, and gas. There's plenty of CO2 in the air. There's more now than there was in the past, and then in the deep past there was way more. And all of those are fine, but why on earth would you do that and like cause a human catastrophe? Nobody else cares. Like it's our decision. I guess I don't quite understand why you would want to do that.
So if I may continue, that's why I said that it's more of a question about like worldviews and our own goal setting, because as a scientist we can only say that if you do X you'll get Y, right? But why, for example, you propose electrifying everything and reducing our carbon footprint. Why is it better, for example, for us than burning all the oil and gas and digging out all the nitrogen and put it into oceans?
Yeah, because the rate of change affects how much something hurts. So if you're going to drive into a tree, you'd rather do it at 1 mile an hour than at 100 miles an hour. And if we dig up all that coal and oil and burn it right now, the rate of climate change will be catastrophic for human society. And the amount of human suffering, I mean, there will be other consequences beyond that, but the amount of human suffering will be dramatic, number one. Number two, the profound inequity associated with the poorest people on the planet doing the least to cause the problem, having the fewest resources to adapt, and then suffering the worst consequences, seems to me, not scientifically, but as a human, profoundly unethical and perhaps the greatest environmental injustice of all time. So it's very much from a human and moral perspective, not because it's good for the planet. There is like I said, the planet is just doing its thing. But for us to live through that transition, I think the probability of catastrophe, global human catastrophe, goes up exponentially, as the temperature does. I mean, as a small example, if we lose the Antarctic ice sheet and Greenland, my university will be underwater and it's on a hill. Now, that's not going to happen next week or whatever, but like if you think about hundreds of millions of people moving very quickly because climate change has made where they are uninhabitable, and you think about the chance then of conflict arising from hundreds of millions or even billions of people moving, I think that chance is very high. I'm not a political scientist or I know, the closest one in the room. But so it's really about building a just and equitable future for us, and that comes much more easily if the climate change problem and other environmental problems are either smaller or moving at a slower pace, and is much harder if they're moving rapidly. So I guess that's my answer. Thank you. Yeah.
I'm curious about your thoughts on the extent to which you think humans can and should engineer ecosystems to function how sort of we think they should.
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, we already use 50% of the land surface simply to have our food. So if you add up all the farms in the world, it's about 15% of the terrestrial ice-free surface. So for scale, that's about the size of South America. And if you add up all the pasture lands, that's about 30+%. If you add that up, it's about the size of Africa. So we're already like engineering ecosystems for our own benefit completely. So I'm not sure that was the part you were talking about. So maybe you could give me a little more context for sort of where you were going, because I can answer that in several different ways, and I'm not sure which one you wanted.
Yeah, so like there's a lot of work, I say like ecosystem ecology and like restoration, trying to take ecosystems back to states that they've historically been in. There's people trying to like genetically engineer trees to fix more carbon, just like all of these sort of projects.
So, that's a great question. So, we've actually had this argument about farms in New England.
Careful.
Yeah.
Treading on our
I know.
here.
I guess what I would say is we have made the world the way we want it to be, and I think that that's probably the way we're going to continue to function. So whether we should, I guess I would prefer if we never cut another tree in the Amazon, for example. I would prefer if we restored the Atlantic forest in Brazil where I work, which is now 85% gone and one of the oldest and most diverse ecosystems on the planet. I would prefer that we had migration corridors through all of our farmland so that organisms can move both in response to climate change and not. And I work very hard to sort of convince people of that. But I do think that we are going to use a lot of land, and so we should do that in a way that makes as much space as possible for everything else. There's a paper by Beneski et al., he was my PhD advisor, and then there's been several follow-ups. So you might have read it since you're an ecosystem ecologist. It's called Human Appropriation of Net Primary Production. So net primary production is the amount of plant growth, or in the ocean, photosynthesis, the total carbon uptake. And that essentially sets how much food is available for everything on the planet that is dependent on primary production. And humans take almost all of it for ourselves, right? And in some ecosystems we take all of it, and some we take almost all of it. And then in some places like the Amazon we don't take very much. But we're taking a huge fraction of the Earth's primary production, and that is crowding out everything else because there's just not as much energy available. If we can learn to do less of that, I would be all in favor. I don't know if that answers your question.
Can I just give a little example based on Amherst?
Yeah, let's give an Amherst example.
Book and plow. Adorable, right?
Adorable.
So adorable, just so cute that students can learn about plants and growing things. And what would Stephen really say? Should all go back to forests, and the farming should be done where farming can be done more efficiently.
For sure. I mean, well, it's a really good example because it really depends on what we value, right? So this is true in Rhode Island too. Everybody's all for local farming, right? It's great. Except for that if you really ate only local farming, you would have like kale and potatoes for a few weeks and then you would starve to death. Right? So why do we want local farming? We want local farming because it's aesthetically pleasing, because there's an ethos to it. It actually doesn't have a lower carbon footprint. If we really wanted to minimize carbon or maximize carbon uptake and minimize carbon loss to the atmosphere, local farming is a bad idea in New England. There should be trees, right? But we have other values that say open land is lovely. I'm on the board of the Audubon Society in Rhode Island, and they're all about preserving open habitat because there are some birds that really like the open habitat. Well, okay, but like there's more carbon stored in trees. And by the way, unfortunately, if you cut down the trees and put up solar panels, that's actually even better for carbon. So it's a multifaceted trade-off, and it all depends on what you value. And science doesn't have anything to say about values. I can tell you how much carbon will be in a farm in Massachusetts, and I can tell you how much carbon will be in a forest in Massachusetts, and I can tell you how much carbon a solar field in Massachusetts will keep out of the air because you're not burning natural gas for your electricity. I can't tell you which one of those is better, or I can tell you my opinion, but there's no scientific answer to that question because better is a human value judgment, right? And I think we're in a world dominated by humans. And so we collectively, our value judgments are going to be what shape the landscape for the foreseeable future. And I think the discussion is about, can we come to consensus, understanding how the systems work and how sensitive we are to changes in those systems? Can we come to consensus about how to best manage them? And maybe it means that there is some farmland here, even though it's not the best carbon storage answer, because there are other things that are important besides carbon. And maybe it doesn't, but that's a conversation that, I think is what sort of how I would approach that. Does that kind of answer your question? Yeah. It's a great question. Other questions?
May I ask one?
Yeah, please.
It's been very pleasant to hear you talk all day long, because you're so good at it, but also because you have this optimism. You have this sense that all is not lost, and the Titanic is not going to go down if we just get our crap together and do something. When I was your age, the most important environmental subject being discussed was zero population growth. Mm-hmm. I wonder how resilient your optimism is if there is unbridled population growth.
But there isn't. So global population is going to top out by mid-century probably at 10 billion or less. 10 billion or fewer, sorry. That wasn't an English major. Well, let me just put it this way. The average American emits 20 tons of CO2 per year. The global average person emits 4.
So what we need is less Americans.
Yes, the world cannot afford more Americans, but population growth in and of itself is largely not the main driver of our environmental problems right now, and is really only still very high in a few parts of the world, and is projected at least to drop there soon too. It actually correlates most strongly with access to education for women, not surprisingly. And so, yeah, unbridled population growth would be a problem if we went to 60 billion people or something like that, but we're not. And so that's not something that keeps me up at night. What keeps me up at night is the ever seemingly insatiable appetite for energy of wealthy people, and the inability to see that a bigger car and a bigger house and a bigger everything is not always the most useful thing. I guess, to put it kindly. But yeah, question.
So I'm in an environmental humanities class right now called Humanity and Nature here at Amherst with Professor Moore and Professor Manilio. And one thing we keep coming back to is the view of ownership of humanity upon nature. And I think in more of like philosophical terms. Do you think it's possible to make a change without humanity having a major change in the way they think philosophically about the world, about their ownership? And is it necessary to come to this conclusion in order to make a change?
Oh, that's a great question. So I'll start by admitting that I don't know the answer. Okay. And that's good, because otherwise you wouldn't have to take the class, right? Yeah. So I don't know the answer, but I'll tell you my own personal philosophy. And for whatever it's worth, just my opinion. I think there are some people, we talked about this a little bit at once, there are some people who think you need to change how we think about ownership, you need to change capitalism, you need to change everything about society that's bad in order to fix this problem. I really hope that's not true, because it seems unlikely to me we're going to do that in the next 7 to 10 years, right? And that's kind of what the climate window is for really dramatic emissions reductions. And certainly, I certainly don't think it's going to happen in the next 30 years. So do I have a utopian vision of what a perfect future looks like? Sure, I do. I bet it's very different than yours, and I bet it's very different from yours, and very different from yours, and I don't think we're going to agree on it. So if we have to agree on that, on a global reworking of how everybody thinks about everything, I think we're in big trouble. Fortunately or unfortunately, I do think those problems are somewhat decoupleable. I think that we can continue to work for a better, more just, equitable, different way of thinking about the world at the same time as we really use the tools we have right now to avoid the meteorite as best we can. And, you know, if that's not true, I really worry. And it's not because I don't share the desire for a better, more equitable, different kind of world. But if you take 100 people and ask them what justice and equity mean, you'll come up with 100 different answers. And if we all have to agree before we can solve these sort of biophysical problems of the planet that we have, that we're inducing right now, I think that's going to be a tough lift, whether or not it would be really nice to have it happen. So, yeah.
I missed the chapter on the meteorite. Is that?
Yeah. I don't know. This is deep philosophy. Oh yeah.
No, I was just gonna.
Lawrence wants to ask a question.
I did. Is that okay?
No.
Yeah.
I'm really nervous because I'm going to get a B-.
I was just wondering, like, how well do you think a democracy is positioned for dealing with these issues?
I totally feel like I'm back in your class.
No.
I can make it stop.
I mean, you look at England, the Prime Minister, you know.
Yeah.
kind of
Well, I mean, our recent history suggests democracy isn't doing so great on that front. But actually, it comes back to this other question, right? Like, so people say, look at capitalism. It's ruined the environment. And, you know, look at the 20th century. It's environmental destruction and the rise of capitalism, or from the Industrial Revolution, we've ruined the environment. And that's true, but like correlation isn't always causation. Like capitalism kind of won, right? And the environment got ruined, but we also discovered fossil fuels at the same time. And so, you know, like it's not like the Soviet Union was doing such a great job on the environment, right? And like capitalism won, and that's why we have climate change. Like they were, you know, and if you look at China today, they're not doing so great. Like so, the problem is that the way that we're doing things is really efficient and easy. And I'm going to say something that everyone's going to get mad at me for, because I like to be provocative. You taught me this. So, like, if you had to name one person who is responsible for keeping the most CO2 out of the atmosphere of any person in all of history, who would you pick?
Genghis Khan.
Genghis Khan?
Yeah.
Okay, I would not pick Genghis Khan.
Christopher Columbus.
I would not pick Christopher Columbus.
I'd pick COVID.
I would pick Elon Musk.
Yeah.
There is no way we would have the number of electric cars on the road or the battery development or any of that stuff, at least right now, if it wasn't for what he did and the extraordinarily obnoxious, arrogant, capitalist maniac that he is. Like, and at the same time, right, he's all of those things and also probably responsible for keeping the most CO2 out of the air of anybody. And so I don't know how politics plays into this. It's your area, not mine, but I don't think it's I don't think it's democracy or autocracy. I think it's bigger than that. It's how we gather our elements from the world, and that we all do that the same way right now because that's the way we've learned to do it. And we need whatever our political system, whatever the best political system, we all need to figure out a better way to do it, or we're going to reap the consequences of that. So, that's my answer.
It's better than a B minus.
Oh yeah.
And it's clear that you're saying we can't go backwards. We need to go forward. I mean, I do know people in the valley, you know, who are trying to basically return to living like off the grid as subsistence farmers, right? And
how many moose can you shoot though? You know, like it's like they're going to run out pretty fast if we all eat them, right? We tried to live on wood. We cut all the trees in New England. So
Several times over.
Yeah, you had a question.
Yeah, you were saying how the system at Brown for decarbonization policy is fully based on these 5 elements.
Not fully, but
or largely.
Somewhat.
I was wondering if you could elaborate on that system and kind of what the plans are.
Yeah, so I don't want to. I have to admit I didn't read Amherst's sustainability plan, so I'm not going to diss Amherst. Maybe it's great. One of the things that I found about college sustainability plans is that it's like it reads like a sort of self-aggrandizing, look how good we are, give us money kind of thing. Like we put some bike racks over here and we have a LEED certified building over here that's really green, and by the way, we recycled this much garbage and like we compost it over here, and there's a farm, and like, whoopee, isn't that great, give us money, we're green. I don't know, I didn't read yours, so I'm not saying. And what we tried to do at Brown, what I tried to do and sort of strong arm people, like people would say to me, well, we gotta address waste, like garbage is a big issue. And I would say, well, why is garbage a big issue? And they'd say, well, garbage emits a lot of greenhouse gases. And I'd say, okay, so it's a greenhouse gas problem. Well, then let's figure out the best way we can to reduce greenhouse gases. Why necessarily are we focused on garbage? And they say, well, the landfill is filling up. And I'd say, okay, well, if the landfill's filling up and we're worried about space, is that the environmental issue we're trying to deal with, space? Like, then let's articulate that landfill space is a major environmental, and well, no, it's not really landfill space. It's like, garbage is bad. Well, why is it bad? Well, there's a lot of embodied carbon in all that stuff you throw out. Like, okay, well, if it's back to carbon, then let's think about carbon. So I really tried to focus us on things that were big issues environmentally, like from the science perspective, things that we could do something about, and I'll talk to that in a minute because there are some things in our plan that we don't know how to deal with, but things that we could do, right? And find the overlap between those two things. So we have five overarching themes in our sustainability plan: the management of carbon and climate change, nitrogen and phosphorus pollution, like eutrophication of water and stuff like that, human health, which we actually don't really know what to do about, but we say is important. Biodiversity loss, which is another one that we don't know what to do about, but we also think is important. And water quality and quantity, right? So we know what to do about carbon. We gotta stop burning stuff. That's pretty easy. It's hard to do, it's expensive, but we know what to do. The nitrogen and phosphorus is really just cutting down red meat on campus and dairy. So we're gonna cut 50% of the red meat and dairy out of our dining by 2030. Which will be the biggest single thing we can do to our nitrogen and phosphorus footprint, other than stopping eating, which we probably won't do. It'd be hard to sell to the parents, I think. But biodiversity loss is a really important, really interesting one. So we recognized that it was important, and we fought hard to have it in there. But then we're like, well, what do we do about that? So the two of us who work on tropical forests said we should stop buying tropical hardwoods. Deforestation in the Amazon and other rainforests is the single biggest driver of biodiversity loss, so we should stop supporting that. Other people said we should plant pollinator-friendly habitat on campus. That will really help with local biodiversity. Now, if you're counting species, there are more tree species in an acre of the Amazon than there are in all of North America. So you're much better off not worrying about what's going on here, but if you care about local biodiversity, which is equally valid, right? And so, to be honest, even though we've articulated that in our sustainability plan, we've not made a lot of traction on biodiversity compared to what we've done with carbon. Across those 5 themes, there are 2 overarching ideas. One, we need to share what we learn with our community, and we need to empower members of our community, particularly members of our, we focused in on our Providence community, which is very economically undeveloped relative to Brown, certainly. We need to share what we understand and help facilitate transitions outside of our campus walls across all of these 5 areas. And then we need to incorporate those 5 areas into the life of every person on campus. So that means in the classroom, it means when they're in the dining hall, it means when they're walking across campus, it means faculty, it means staff, it means students, it means everybody into the educational mission of the university. So those are the 2 overarching things. And I think it's a little bit different because we're not counting bike racks and we're not putting up a performative bunch of solar panels that are providing no real energy to the system. And we're not having one building that's green so that we can bring donors there and tell them that this one is very inefficient while we continue to burn coal and all the rest of them. And so,
Amherst does.
No, Amherst. Hey, you guys are going to be fossil fuel free by 2030. That's going to beat us, right? We have a bigger campus to deal with in a different setting, but no, you're doing great. I mean, so I'm not dissing Amherst's plan, which I didn't even read. but does that answer your question about how it was different?
Yeah.
I'm going to suggest we thank our guests again for their time.
Thank you for coming.
Stephen will still answer questions.
Yes, I totally. I never shut up.
I also want to say that we do have a few books over there if you're convinced you ought to read it, and who isn't. At a slight discount, you can write us a check. It's not us, it's Amherst Books. Pay cash, $25. Or there's also a URL there that will take you right to a direct purchase website. So that's all available over there. Fred's going to man the station.
That.
It's
And make
also-
sure you get your book signed over there.
Yeah, I'm happy to sign over there.
Okay? Thank you all for coming out. And thanks, guys.